Welcome back, everybody, to part 2 of our show prep with AJ Sims. So today we were going to start with around 8 weeks out, kind of where we left off last time. What's going on, AJ? How you doing?
What's up, brother? Doing phenomenal, man. We got some great feedback from the last podcast, which is really encouraging. I'm excited to get everybody more information on deep dive into prep and methodologies that me and you really agree on, which is really cool to be able to get together with somebody. Not that I have a problem talking to someone that's in disagreement, because that sharpens us, but it's really cool because we were speaking right before this on how everyone's kind of almost trying to reinvent the wheel of everything that has worked for so long. And if it ain't broke, we don't fix it, right? So we just keep things a little more simplistic, which what I believe does for not only coach and athlete is it takes away the overthinking process, which reduces overall stress, in my opinion.
And that's kind of what we do as coaches, right? Like a lot of our job is to eliminate that unnecessary thought, right? Because anytime I've coached myself, or you see other people do it, they tend to overthink. It's too much cardio, not enough cardio. The diet, constant diet changing, gear changes, all these things that just aren't necessary sometimes. So one of the things that you and I, we agree on a ton, but one of the things that we agree with that is like slowly changing now for some reason is around 8 weeks, a switch to short esters, right? Like I see a lot of guys now doing some weird stuff where they're running long esters still in. Not that you can't, but it's unpredictable. It's not easy to control, and the look is not always guaranteed, right? Because you're playing a guessing game. In off season, it doesn't really matter, but like the stage lighting, every little ounce of water makes a difference.
Yeah,
so at 8 weeks, I typically switch, right? So we went from it was long estered stuff, including EQ, to I would usually bring in test propionate, mass propionate, tren acetate, and depending on where the test is and stuff, possibly Anavar, possibly not. Winstrol would be something I would add, but typically a little further down. Anavar, I don't know if I touched on it before or not. I think Anavar seems to be very useful when testosterone doses are lower. I think once a test, if you're running, 700 milligrams of test propionate, I'm not really sure what Anavar is adding to the stack.
Yeah.
At least in my experience, it seems like it's just overkill and you're doing organ stress.
Yeah.
For no reason.
I mean, my thinking is changed as well as Anavar. I see it more as a really good benefit for adding to TRT.
Yep.
Obviously, like you said, testosterone levels are lower, so you're not getting this super physiological response. You're getting a great response, but adding Anavar on top of that is a beautiful synergy together. But as far as like a pre-contest setting, I would rather save any type of orals for Winstrol, which would be my absolute favorite. So if I had to pick and choose, either taking Anavar out early, adding Winstrol in early, I'm always going to veer on the side of Winstrol earlier, take that Anavar out. And even with Proviron, and just saving room for other compounds. Anavar, while it has phenomenal benefits, even, the podcast that you've done on fixing maybe even long-term thyroid functionality, I don't believe in that type of setting at 8 weeks out when you have that many compounds that it's really needed, honestly.
Yeah. And it's, something else with what we agree with is also, and I think from a distance, people don't always understand it. I tend to pivot quickly in prep at the end, depending on what the athlete's looking like or how they feel. So I might have a game plan. Like I give everyone a rough outline. I leave some blanks in there on purpose. And I discuss what those blanks might be. And then based on the feedback I get from them and how they look, I might change entirely, right? Like it might be putting something in, pulling something else out, switching something around, more cardio, more food, something, I'm sure you're similar because we don't know, right? And I don't know how he's going to react, and it changes.
Yeah, no, it's a great segue for basically the way that I do check-ins, especially with all my athletes going into, I would say, the last 4 to 6 weeks. Is we're doing check-ins typically every 48 to 24 hours, which keeps me extremely busy, right? And this is usually, I switch everybody over to text message on usually WhatsApp if they're international, just due to it being an easier way to communicate. It could change on the fly. I mean, you may have an outline, may have a plan, you may have a cycle set up, you may have fat burners in there, you may have a certain amount of clenbuterol, whatever the case may be. But if that person checks in and something went sideways in 24 hours, which it can when you're that sensitive, you have to know how to call things on the fly. I believe that's what makes a great coach. And I don't think a lot of coaches really talk about that because they talk about more of the totality of the setup, and they over intellectualize contest prep when a lot of it, yes, you do have to have intelligence, you must have experience, but you also have to know how to call things on the fly,
Yeah.
especially when getting to the tail end.
And people I think sometimes it's hard on the athlete, right? They kind of like to know what to expect, and sometimes we don't know what to tell them. I always tell people, specifically with peak week, and we talked about this before, that I don't know what peak week looks like. I have a rough idea about depletion and refilling someone up, but outside of that, I don't have a clue what it's going to look like.
I think that's the best way to go about it.
There's just no way to know, right? Anyone who tells you 16 weeks out what peak week looks like is either lying or they've never done it before.
Yeah, or they just have no idea what they're talking about, because the body changes literally daily, not only day to day, but hour to hour, especially the last few days with, mineral electrolyte balance and glycogen and just overall systemic stress and how the body's adapting to that stress. Do you have somebody that may have higher aldosterone levels? Because that does happen. A lot of people will be higher on aldosterone. I've seen it before, which is why I've basically, introduced using things that are an aldosterone antagonist, like aldactone. Very sparingly. Now, that's not one of my favorites, but it does have application when it's needed. So, these are getting into basically the details of a contest prep and how they can change very often. And you're absolutely right. You there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, we'll have to edit that part out. Sorry, someone called me. You're absolutely right when you make the point that you have to make calls on the fly, and we have a generalized plan in our heads, but that could change.
Yeah, and I think, just to touch on aldactone real fast, in case people don't know what it is, it's basically it's going to cause sodium excretion, right? So it's not always the right tool, like you said. It might not be what you want.
Yeah. No, it's not always.
There are times when we get to peak week, we can talk about
it's definitely
that's going to change.
Just to kind of touch on that, diuretics aren't always needed from a pharmacological standpoint. You can induce diuresis through natural remedies, which is what I always veer to do first. And obviously also estrogen control is going to be key to give you that very dry, crisp, as long as the body fat is off. Those things come after. And unless you really know what you're doing with that balance, it's very difficult to manage that properly. However, again, body fat has to be off. Estrogen has to be managed. Switching to quicker esters, I'm 100% on board with. And I think that it's overthought, and people have tried to reinvent the wheel of something that's worked for so long. And I'm not sure if it is to gain notoriety or to sound more intelligent maybe than they are. I'm not quite sure. That's not a shot at anybody personally.
Yeah. No, I mean, who knows?
People, like you said, there are people that do utilize that and they do get great results. Kind of the same way Dexter Jackson was known to eat Taco Bell 3 weeks out and was one of the most conditioned guys on stage. Just because one person or two people do it doesn't mean that everybody can do it. So remember that we're all individualistic. Your miles may vary.
Yep. And what we're talking about, so people understand, in case they've not been in touch with the new stuff, a lot of the guys are running, right? They're trying to use the most minimal amount of trenbolone, which this stuff's a personal preference. If that's really what you choose to do, they're going to use the most minimal amount of trenbolone. We're talking milligrams, single milligrams of this stuff microdosed, and huge amounts of masteron and long ester test. And then they're flipping the ratio of the long ester test and the masteron to try to create that look. And I've seen as high as 3,000 milligrams of masteron an anthe, which to me is wild. I would say, again, not a big talking about dose guy, but I would say 800 milligrams, probably the top. 700, 800. You don't necessarily need to use that much. There's a huge point of diminishing returns with these drugs. And it's not an excuse not to use an AI. I hate to say that again, but use the proper tool for the job. Don't try to add an untested, cancer drug in here that's to do a job when we have a perfectly good tool for that exact job without adding milligrams. If you want to add more if you want to add more steroid milligrams in, then you can use something like what's the I'm drawing like this, the suicide inhibitor. Aromasin technically is a steroid, backbone. So if you're so concerned with adding it at that point, you're basically adding masteron in anyway, because it's the same structure. Versus Arimidex. But I've always just stuck with Arimidex. Unless you have a really big issue, then I might swap to letrozole. And then at that point, or if you need tamoxifen, so people should also understand that you're not really supposed to mix tamoxifen and arimidex together. It reduces the
Letrozole
effectiveness.
and Nolvadex.
Yeah, it reduces the effectiveness of the arimidex. It's not causing harm. You're taking one drug that's destroying the other drug. So if you really need to add that other layer in there, like if someone's very gyno prone, or whatever, it's safer to me to use Letro and add the tamoxifen if you have to. But I generally would start with the arimidex. It seems more mild to me. Letro is pretty harsh.
Yeah, no, it is harsh. It is harsh, but and we'll touch on this as we get closer to the show. It works phenomenal closer to the tail end of the show. And one of the big things that I love to do is pulling labs every 2 to 3 weeks. Some guys won't do it because they're like, dude, that's just ridiculous. But it's kind of like, for me, it's like anything outside of that, we're kind of shooting in the dark. We don't really know what's going on, especially if someone's body is just not responding. So not only do we need to see, estradiol as a total with E2 total and free test, but get that full range of thyroid all the way to reverse T3 to see if we're having that cascading effect of that being bound up, right?
Yep.
So there's a lot of things that I like to really gauge every variable and really control it. It's really micromanaging to the point of some guys just aren't willing to do it. And I experienced that a lot with a lot of the top pros, which, again, I don't work really with IFBB pros anymore for multiple reasons. But there's a big reason was they are hard to micromanage. A lot of them don't want to do that. And they'll hear a lot of regurgitation online and they just kind of want to copy that, right? And it's, well, your body's different. From a physiological standpoint, we may have to approach things completely unorthodox or outside of the box, customize it towards what you need and really find out what the body needs, right? So, it's kind of like the camps that they have over in Oxygen Gym in Kuwait and how they have everybody doing 2-a-days, and not everybody needs that, and not everybody can recover from that. And if you don't know how to manage recovery and fatigue, then you are going to just dig yourself into a hole that you'll never fully come out of.
Yep.
And that systemic inflammation is going to carry its way over into the show. So at 8 weeks out, which is where we're at right now, we've switched the esters. The diet, I'm sure, is getting more intense as we go along. Cardio is probably starting to pick up depending on the individual. Body fat's coming down. You're probably starting to get that heavy feeling on certain days in the legs. And then, of course, this is where people start to tend to abuse stimulants just to have energy, which I understand stimulants have great usage, and, even utilizing caffeine for, some effective lipolysis, obviously, is going to also be an inhibitor for appetite. It's going to suppress it, right? It's going to work against, curbing that appetite. But, at the same time, if we're doing all those things and then we're losing sleep, we're kind of missing the whole point of what we're trying to do, right? So I try to get guys to use the minimal effective dose of stimulants when it comes to it. And obviously we talked about the beta-3, clenbuterol, as it works on the beta-3 receptor and how that can be continually used, and then how to time that properly so it doesn't affect your sleep because of the half-life being so long.
Yeah. So typically,
sense.
This is about when you'd introduce clenbuterol and those, or albuterol or whatever, depending on what you want.
Yeah. Typically, for sure. What I try to do is prolong the diet as long as I can, and then not utilize any type of thyroid medication until I see labs show that it's really needed, right? Yeah. I don't just throw in T4 to throw in T4 with growth hormone because the consensus is that it, it down regulates the conversion. I'm always going to start with micronutrients in the form of iodine and selenium and even precursors of L-tyrosine first to really get the functionality. And then, of course, use dietary, hacks and utilization of refeeds and diet breaks and cardio breaks too, which I'm a fan of cardio breaks. A lot of people talk about diet breaks, but I'm actually a huge fan of stopping cardio for a week or two and resetting the body and actually bringing the diet down and getting more into a deficit and using something like a clenbuterol during that phase, right? Because we're having less energy output, but the body's systemic inflammatory response from all that cardio training and just beating it really gets a nice rest, and it gets a reset that when you introduce the cardio back in, you get even more of a fat loss effect. And so it comes down to cycling those things, right? So again, a good coach is going to have a keen eye on when to make those transitional phases.
Yeah. And a lot of times it's biofeedback. It's not just looking at an image, right? Like seeing a picture of an athlete doesn't tell you the whole story. You
No,
could
not
have,
at all.
and especially with these top guys, because they're very good at masking how they feel, right? They're
Oh, yeah.
great at posing. They can hold a face. You know, you don't really know until you talk to them. And like you said, what with going back to some of the pros, you see it a lot even in the off season. They'll listen to an extent, but then they ask the other pros what they're doing, and then they want to do the same thing. So even if there's no logic, and a great example of this is Anadrol, right? Like I see a lot of guys running 500 milligrams of Anadrol. So Anadrol has a flat curve response at 150 milligrams. And now that's not necessarily in 300-pound bodybuilders, so it might be slightly higher in a bigger dude, but it ain't 500 milligrams. So it's one of those drugs that as soon as you get to a dose, it flattens out and there's only side effects. There's no more response. So 500 to me seems a little crazy. 150, 200 perhaps, but like 500 is no reason for that kind of stuff. But they do it because other guys do it, right? Like, you know, Mr. Olympia is doing it, so I must do it if I want to be Mr. Olympia. That sort of thought process. And like you said, just because they're doing it doesn't mean you need to do that stuff.
No, not at all. I mean, I've seen great responses at the tail end of a prep just for muscular fullness and obviously performance in the gym on 25 milligrams of Anadrol. Small amounts without getting side effects and blood pressure increases or, you know, gastric issue, GI issues, obviously, and stomach lining issues. So, I mean, we utilize the tools necessary to get the job done. We don't just say, hey, you know, this guy's really good, so let's do what he's doing, right? I mean, because that doesn't mean that just because he's really good means it's even the right thing to do. You got to do what's best for your physique. This, again, your mileage may vary in everything that you do, and it's all about learning how to get the most out of the least amount. So obviously, from a dietary standpoint, you're going to have to dip down enough into a deficit where you're going to be very hungry for the most part. And that's another thing. It's funny you touched on that. People like to mask it because I'll always ask my guys, are you hungry? I'm not looking for them to respond to me in a sense of, I think they're complaining. When their hunger gets extremely elevated the last 4 to 6 weeks, I like that. That's showing me that we're getting somewhere that we need based off the biofeedback. We know with the, you know, ghrelin, the hunger hormone, and leptin, and usually we're having the higher conversion of T4 to T3. Not always. This is more anecdote that I've seen over the years. We're usually getting somewhere that we need to. When hunger is really slowing down, okay, what's actually going on in the background causing that? Is it stress induced? Is it, you know, your sleep is getting irritated, like you're sleeping a lot less, which typically if you do sleep less, ghrelin does go up, insulin sensitivity goes down. But usually if you're doing everything and adhering to the program, when hunger gets really high, it's a great biofeedback for me. And that could be genetic too, because people do have different hunger hormone signals. But typically, if you've been following the client from 20 weeks plus and then all the way down, you know, man, I'm starving. Like I just did a high carb day. And then the next day, I'm even more hungry.
Yep.
We did something from a physiological standpoint internally where we're going to see results happen in the next 72 hours. Typically that refeed or supersaturation did what it needed to do. So yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you're saying, man.
We're bringing up refeeds again too. I don't know. You might do it differently than me. I would typically like carb cycling and stuff to me in the off season is a little different structure. I think during prep, when you are going to be hungry, like you said.
Yeah.
When you're at the end, and now genetics do vary, but you are going to be really, really hungry. If you're not really hungry, you're not that lean. Yeah. I mean, I stayed incredibly lean when I was younger for years, a few years on end. I was starving all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. Like, I don't think people understand the sacrifice to have paper thin skin. You are hungry. You might be very good at controlling it or not showing it, but you're hungry.
Your body is just partitioning like a Ferrari. It's just literally running through food in every sense. Yeah. And just like you said, at that point too, that's when people start to struggle with going hypoglycemic. And then you have to kind of implement, you know, maybe fattier cuts of meat like red meat or salmon, wild caught salmon, or even utilizing different, you know, essential fatty oils, you know, coming from extra virgin olive oil, which should always be in a dark glass bottle, by the way, because when light penetrates it, it destroys all the good benefits from it, or getting an extra virgin coconut oil because it's made up of 50% MCTs. or even, you know, some sort of Brazil nut, because Brazil nuts have selenium in it too for iodine production. So you may have to, you know, put that in with the carbohydrates at the end just to slow down the absorption of you partitioning through the carbohydrates, essentially, which is what a lot of people do too when they carb up, because when they're carbing up and they're utilizing glucose disposal agents or insulin, or even without that, they're just, you know, I've seen, because, you know, I'll have my guys take their glucose fasted and postprandial, and it literally will just drop from, you know, your normal postprandial, and then they'll go down to 50 in a really quick period of time. So then we have to kind of control it. And that's why, well, again, I go on a tangent and I kind of get ahead of myself because I get excited about this stuff. That's why I'll have implementation the last couple of days of fattier cuts of meat. We're using more bison meat. We're using more red meat. We're using more wild caught salmon, just to kind of slow that down.
Yeah. And at a certain point, you need more energy substrate in there too, to use. Right. So going back to refeeds for a second. So I typically, at that point, when someone's getting very lean, I'll watch their weight as well. When it starts to drop, if they're moving, like if the standard, if I'm having a guy lose like a pound, 2 pounds a week, you know, and it starts to drop to 3 to 4, you know, they're clearly starting to tap into tissue at that point, regardless of the drugs. I'll incorporate a refeed, and then I'll measure them again the next day, because sometimes they need multiple in a row.
Yes.
Right? I think that's people miss. It's not always one refeed. Real lean guys like me, I take 2, because my weight will actually drop after a high day again. Like it'll continue. It just speeds it up even more, and it'll plummet. 2 generally stabilizes me, or even gets me back up a pound, which is just glycogen at that point. And then I can go right back to a deficit. So that's, to me at least, that's how I would manage carb cycling, more the end of a cut versus in an off season, where I might just do like BDM, high and low days, depending on, you know, certain training days and stuff. At the end, it's really, you want to pull the deficit as long as you can. And I find most guys, 4 days a low in a row is about most that the human body can tolerate. Like we're talking really low, like, right. I mean,
that's the max I'll take.
Dark place.
Yeah.
Like there's a dark place you have to go. You have to be very comfortable with a place that most humans are not comfortable going with food on purpose. And you have to stay there.
Yeah, 100%. And then what we know, you know, also is when we get those refeed days in, obviously, you know, bringing the carbohydrates, even in the evening time, serotonin's released, cortisol comes down, they're going to sleep even better, which is phenomenal for recovery. When they wake up, their mood is elevated. So all these neurological chemicals that are happening in the neurotransmitters, you know, dopamine or adrenaline, all these things they're just firing better, right? They're just more cognitively enhanced. Doesn't last too long, because when you're that lean, it's just, you blow right through it. But yeah, man, I will take refeeds, sometimes 2 days for sure, 3 days if it's needed. And on top of that, if they need to add in, you know, what I call a super saturation day, which is going to be your really high glycemic, more processed foods that really digest well. And then on top of that, we're going to add in possibly a free meal that could be in the form. And again, when I say free meal, it's not so much free, because I do control that variable, because I don't want someone to go eat a large pizza and Krispy Kreme and have these gastric issues for 3 days and systemic inflammation, and they feel horrible. Their joints are achy. You know, I'm talking more along the lines of a homemade cheat meal, you know, grass-fed burgers, grass-fed cheese, sourdough bread. Food. Exactly. Or if we go get sushi, I'll control it. I'll say no cream cheese, no fried rolls, you know, this amount of sushi, go get low fat sorbet or angel food cake that has basically no fat. You know, so we're really getting an overfeeding, and then the person has a great night of sleep. And then obviously, you know, glycogen is super compensated. They're loaded. They're ready to train. They're feeling a great pump, and that could last for 48 to 72 hours. Then you'll get the drop off. And then what I try to do is I try to figure out, okay, how many days does it take for this individual to return to baseline weight? And then how many days does it take them to drop below that baseline weight? And then as a coach, you get all this data. So when you make these calls, you can literally sit back and know, I know this person's body's response. I know exactly what's going to happen. This is what works for them. And what it does is it allows the client to kind of relax too. And they start to understand, I think I'm in really good hands, and I'm going to just continue to trust the process. And what it does too is it sets them up for, like you said, those dark days. Because when you're getting into day 2, day 3 of a low carb, you know, day 4 is a little easier if you know something's coming the next day. But those mid days where you're just literally looking at your watch every hour, when can I eat? You're just drinking tons of water and chewing ice. I mean, I used to be so hungry, I would sit and chew ice at night, because just the satisfactory feeling of chewing something. But that's what it takes, man. It's very difficult to get this lean, and that is more than half the battle of presenting the best physique possible. So you guys need to really understand that me and Kurt are going to introduce a lot of maybe new methodologies to you. But at the end of the day, if that body fat's not there, forget about it. You just need to push the show back and give it a couple more weeks of dieting and just take yourself into a deeper deficit and really dig in, really, really dig in, because it hurts.
Yeah. And with the refeeding too, like you talked about with the simple stuff, I know I use all sorts of stuff, pie filling, gummy bears, whatever is like zero fat, that are new to a lot of people, right? They're not used to these classic, they would be considered unclean, not typical bodybuilding foods, but you're going to get glycogen replacement much faster. You'll still get the same amount of net glycogen replacement using with fiber. It just takes hours versus like if you're going to eat oatmeal. And the other problem we all run into is if you try to use things with fiber, like vegetables, on a high day, you're not going to be able to eat enough.
Yeah. So
you want to use the simplest stuff you can use.
It's a great point. So on a refeed, I'll always drop protein down because carbs are protein sparing. Dietary fats are trace, if not even existent. I don't need them. Essential fats in the form of fish oils, krill oil, that's about all I'll put in there. And then everything else is going to be coming from carbohydrates. That is the goal, is glycogen replenishment. That is what we want. That is what we need at that point. So that is going to come in the form of very high laden foods in terms of density in carbohydrates, but the volume is easy to eat because you try to go eat 200 grams of raw weight oatmeal as opposed to 200 grams of cereal, in the form of a Frosted Flakes. And it's just completely night and day. You're going to feel totally logged down, bloated, and you won't have the gastric emptying effect quick enough to get the next meal in. Or even in the form of jasmine rice. I mean, eat 500 grams of cooked jasmine rice is going to be extremely difficult. I don't care how big you are and how hungry you are. It's just, again, like Kurt said, you're going to get the same glycogen replenishment, but it's not going to be as easy. So we want digestibility. We want the people to feel almost light on their feet throughout the day so that their training feels great in the gym and they're just, really focused mentally on what they're doing. And also from a palatable standpoint, it's a nice change up and it gives someone the ability to continue to go back into that deficit. Because remember, guys, there are some individuals that are militant, like, you, whatever, man, I'll do it. But not everybody's like that. So you got to figure out from a psychological standpoint, how does this individual tick and set them up? Okay, we need to optimize fat loss still, but I got to work with this mind. This mindset has to be. Yeah, man. Coaching is so much more than just the physiological standpoint, but the psychological standpoint.
Probably 90% of it is that.
They go exactly.
And we're all different. Like like you said, our tolerance is different. Like I know, like if I had to do your diet, I know you would tolerate anything. I could say I need you to eat thumbtacks 4 meals a day, and then you can eat regular nails, the other 2 nails, and you would ask me how much water you should drink with them. Versus other guys like wouldn't necessarily do anything that you ask. And the other thing, like you were talking about with the biofeedback and letting the coach take the wheel and relaxes, is communication with your coach and actually doing what you're asked. Like you get guys, you always have a couple guys that just don't tell you quite the whole story, or they're not doing what you say, right? You give them 600 grams of carbs and they eat 400 grams of carbs. But how do we know then how to peak you if you're not actually communicating what you're doing?
Yeah, we need to know.
If I think you're doing X and you're doing Y, I have no idea what's going on.
You got to check every box, and your coach has to know every.
No one's gonna get mad. You just have to know what you're doing, what you're thinking, what you're feeling, how your body, what it's reacting. We end up knowing as coaches a lot of stuff that most people don't know. I know how you go to the bathroom. I know what volume is coming out. Like at the end, we could talk about like urine volume. Like it's important with kidney health. Like we know all that stuff. We have to know all that stuff.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I get down to the nitty gritty, and the guys, if they listen to this that have worked with me, they'll know. I'll ask them what the color of the pee is, how much pee is coming out, bowel movement frequency. I mean, get back on the scale, find what your weight is at. We find the money weight, and then we stick that money weight and we hold it, because that's typically the look that we want to hold. And we can basically maintain it through specific fluid intake with the amount of carbohydrates that we need, with a certain amount of sodium or potassium balance. So yeah, Kurt, I mean, it all comes down to exactly what we're saying. It's all a fine balance between physiological response and psychological response, synergistically working together with the individual. And then we are basically, as coaches, we are tracking every single variable. And it would sound to the listener like you guys are so neurotic and overthink. It's not overthinking, because this is data that we need to take in, and we take the pressure off of you. You don't think about this. This is what we're computing in our brains to know how we can steer you and land the plane, for lack of better terms, so that you have the best look on stage.
Yep. And it's also why neither of us are super keen on taking over preps at the very end.
Oh yeah.
Like, I mean, I have a package on my website that is basically for that. It costs more money because it's a pain.
Oh yeah.
I need to deal with it.
It's a lot of work. I mean,
it's a lot of work, and it happens. We get them. But it's like,
yeah, you're usually cleaning up somebody's mess that somebody else created, or maybe the individual just didn't know what they were doing. So you're coming in last minute, essentially doing emergency Hail Marys to try to correct this as fast as you can. So it's a lot of work to do it the right way.
Yeah. So we'll go back to, so you're, now the guys, 4-ish, 3 weeks out, right? Like they should be. I like to see guys pretty much ready about that time out, right? Like I don't love to bring it, like peak week is not the time for fat loss. I don't know how many times I could say that. You should not be making major changes. The appearance can change slightly depending on glycogen and minerals, but you don't want to be changing fat loss. There's no fat loss occurring or muscle growing that's occurring then.
No, not at all.
And they should be more relaxed at that point anyway.
Yeah.
So assuming that fat loss, right? Because that's the kind of the critical thing. And like 4 weeks, if they're not lean enough, then you have to make a decision as a coach. Can I pull this out in the next 2 weeks, or are we delaying the show?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what it comes down to. So yeah, by 4 weeks out, we should be getting really close where, the glutes are dug out, the hamstrings have the piano chords back there. So we're getting really dug out from the rear. Some people come in shape from the rear first and the front last. So not usual, but there are some individuals like that. So then again, we have to balance leg fullness to the ratio of upper body fullness. What's coming in first? How do we balance it? What do we need to fix? Is this a cortisol issue where they're holding? Is it possible estrogen? Again, we get labs. We see where cortisol is at, aldosterone's at. We see where estrogen is at. We can balance that. We can start to employ and deploy rather, and put in different AIs that we need to pull out different anabolics. If there's growth hormone involved, what type of growth are they using? Is it pharmaceutical grade? Is it UG? Typically, if it's UG, I'm pulling that out because I don't even trust that it's real. So I'm like, you're just wasting your time right now. We don't know for sure. So if it ain't pharmaceutical, that's going. And then where's the levels of growth, coming in, how is it affecting you? Some people, obviously, we know with Serostim, and you can touch on more of this. We know that they put a diuretic ingredient in it to help you excrete.
Serostim actually doesn't have one. The other
one. Sorry, Serostim doesn't. Is it ginotropin?
Yeah, ginotropin does. Yeah.
Okay. So Serostim doesn't. So you're right. So I got those two mixed up. So what I've noticed with Serostim is it can actually really, guys never get out of that water retention. So at the end, I'll start to kind of titrate it down. I don't pull it out.
You'd use 4, 6.
Yeah, exactly. So typically if they're at like 8 or 10, whatever they're doing, I'll start titrating it down slowly. And then if the person is really, really dry and they're just very responsive to it, I can run it all the way into the show almost typically, but usually I'll pull it out and or titrate it down depending on the look. So again, so now we're dealing with different variables of compounds, growth hormones, thyroid medication, clenbuterol, albuterol. Do we have yohimbine in there? How's the person reacting to yohimbine? What's the stimulant usage like? Sleep starts to kind of get negatively impacted. So then now we need to fix that. How do we reduce cortisol as a whole? So we'll go into those factors as well. And then systemic inflammation coming down, reps in reserve and training. You still need to train hard, but you do need to be able to manage fatigue to an extent where you're not doing, see, back in the day, there was a little different thought process of doing like 10 drop sets per set and just balls to the wall. And there is a time and a place for that. I absolutely do believe.
Not 2 weeks out.
Yeah, exactly. So we're not trying to set personal records at 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out, but we are trying to still get enough stimulus. We are trying to get enough caloric expenditure, and we are still getting a little bit of the fat off at that point. But by 2 weeks out, I believe, and I tell all my guys this, that fat should be gone. We should pretty much be skinless at that point. And now, like you said, it's management of glycogen, mineral shifting, and then, estrogen control as well.
Yeah. So just to back up for a second, because people will ask, because we've said it multiple times that, protein is carbohydrate sparing. So people understand this. So you basically, your body needs glucose. The human body runs on glucose, despite what, keto or carnivore guys want to say about it. The average person, like 140 grams of glucose a day for your nervous system. If you don't take in those carbohydrates, your body's going to make that glucose, and it's going to make it for protein. So specific amino acids like glycine, alanine can be broken down in the liver, called gluconeogenesis, to make that glucose. You can't really make glucose from fat. It's not very easy. It has to, you have to cleave off basically the backbone of the triglyceride, which is glycerol. It's a very long, slow process. It's not efficient. It's not occurring while you're exercising. So like you said, when your carbs are super high, you don't need as much protein. I think you and I also probably have shifted our thought with protein over the last couple of years. Right? We used to run tons of protein, and we kind of realized at a certain point, you don't need that much. Like a gram per pound is plenty. You don't need to go.
I've seen better digestion. I've seen better digestion. I've seen smaller waistlines, and I've seen just as much muscle tissue being preserved, if not even growing into the show.
You don't need as much, right, as we used to think, in the 90s and 2000s. So then with, managing all those other things. So something with, you mentioned magnesium before. So magnesium is obviously very important for everyone all the time. No American is not deficient in magnesium. You can't use vitamin D without it. And using things like trenbolone cause more depletion in magnesium. It's one of the reasons why sleep gets so disrupted. So you can use more, when you're using harsher 19-nors and things like that to kind of improve sleep. With magnesium, people ask about dosing. There is, the RDA is too low. And there is no exact dose. Like, I couldn't tell you what your dose is. You basically have to titrate up until your stomach gets a little weird, and then you pull it back down a hair, and that's how you do it, right? That's what I do with everyone. That's what I do with myself. That's what I do with my wife. You just figure out what your stomach can tolerate, and that's what you run. And you want to use the glycinate, or the biglycinate form is usually the easiest at night, because you're going to get the glycine benefit for sleep as well.
100%.
The oxide, you don't want to use the oxide form. It's a bigger molecule, so it's more potent. It's like using test suspension versus test cypionate, but it'll destroy your stomach.
Yes.
So you do not want to use
get that laxative effect like no tomorrow.
So, and same with citrate, the bigger, because those are bigger molecules. You just don't want to touch those if you don't have to, and they're cheap.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm sure you're the same way. I spend a lot of money on supplements. I use what I deem to be the best quality supplements I can find, because it's your health. You only get one set of organs. You only get one.
When it comes to magnesium, I'm always usually going to Thorne products.
That's what I use as well. I use Thorne multi.
Thorne's definitely going to be the leader, and typically single ingredient. But we will be doing that very soon, because we actually use the same manufacturer as Thorne, so we're doing the same quality control as Thorne too. So I said, if I was going to start doing single active ingredient supplements, it has to be, because I've always been a huge fan of Thorne. So we're going to always, make sure that we're on the same level playing field as them. So Thorne is phenomenal. But man, magnesium is a game changer. Like you said, the majority of people, if not everybody, is absolutely magnesium deficient. And then of course, trenbolone and those 19-nor drugs are going to definitely drop that down even lower. So really good point there, Kurt. It's definitely a game changer. And again, sleep. I always tell guys, if you aren't sleeping, then we've missed everything, because we're just not going to get the results that we need to. It happens every time. If I have a guy that is, maybe a different type of shift worker, and he's only getting 4 to 5 hours, we never see progress until they're finally getting that night off, and then they sleep 8 to 9 hours. And I'm like, there you go. There's the body's natural response, which is another thing that I always do, is I always start gauging around 4 to 6 weeks out, the night weight to the morning weight. I like to see naturally what the body does overnight. How much does it dump overnight? That way, leading into the final week, we collect that data, and we can see before any type of diuresis inducing supplementation or any nutritional protocols or any pharmacological diuretics, how is this body occurring naturally overnight? And then we can basically add on that variable. So I start engaging someone's night weight, and then I know if they dump, 10 pounds, say overnight, if they're drinking 2 gallons of water, taking in 7 grams of sodium with 6 meals in, then I know if they're going to bed super, super light that night before, well, I know typically we're going to be waking up much lighter. I do that because that sets my mind up. Okay, I kind of know what's coming tomorrow, so I'm going to start setting my mind up for this client or this athlete. Doesn't always happen, because, your night could be disrupted by children, your kids. It could be just a bad night's sleep, or even if you sleep super deep and you didn't urinate as frequently, which is good, but you didn't dump as much water. So you collect this data as a coach, and we're getting into what people would say these are kind of semantics, guys, but this really isn't. I mean, this is valuable data, because what we're dealing with on the bodybuilding level is the human body is a phenomenal thing that we are still, and you know this, Kurt, because you're in the medical field, we are still learning every single day about its mechanisms and how it works. So this data is so important to really collect and assess the person each and every day. And like you said, pictures alone and even scale weight alone is not going to give you the whole story. You need every biofeedback marker.
Yeah, exactly. I was pulling up, I was going to share this because I think people get a kick out of this. Because people ask about, when people talk about human metabolism, let's see. So you can see, can you see this here? So
I can see it, yeah.
So this is how complicated. Let me see if I can get a closer view of this. Of course, it made it smaller. You get a sense of how complicated these are all charts. Complicated human metabolism. So,
yeah,
so
it froze for a little bit, but I see, yeah.
The diagram didn't work quite as I thought it would. So yeah, like you said, it's incredibly complicated, and we don't know everything there is to know, and it's constantly moving.
No, and what I tell too, you know, and we may get some pushback on this, but this is what I say, because, you know, we do know, and we should collect data from long-term controlled clinical studies, right? But these clinical studies are not being done with 260-pound shredded bodybuilders. So there is evidence-based stuff, which we do need to take into consideration, but there's anecdote as well through experience. We have to understand that we're dealing with a different type of human body. Even if you're 180 pounds ripped to shreds, we're still dealing with something that's a little bit different, right? So, you know, again, and I've said it, on paper, bodybuilding doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always add up, because you could tell someone, I've cut my cardio, I've cut all my fat burners out, I'm eating 600 grams of carbs a day, and I can't stop dropping. And, you know, at that point, it's almost like, well, where's the explanation for that? You know, even from a scientific approach, obviously you could correlate it into, you know, you're super insulin sensitive, your T3 free and total is sky high. But, you know, at the end of the day, man, there's more than that. There's just
we don't know
than that. Anabolism is super high. You know, all these things are happening in the body. So just remember, guys, that, you know, don't get too analytical on paper with bodybuilding, but always go with your biofeedback, your sleep, your digestion and bathroom usage, your overall look, your pumps in the gym, which also will fade on specific days, but pumps, strength, progression, and overall body weight, but fat loss. I have a guy that I've been prepping for 6 years. We've always tried to make weight to turn pro. We turned pro last year as a middleweight, and I think it was Masters Nationals over 35. He's doing his pro debut, and we're in a different realm now because we don't have to make a weight cap. He's been at 202 for 5 weeks. So on paper, a trainer would be like, what's going on? You're not lit. He literally looks better almost every day. He's harder, he's leaner, he's more separate. The scale doesn't always move. Nope. So then we have to go by the appearance. We have to go by, you know, we're losing fat, but obviously not only are we retaining tissue, we have to be gaining it as well.
Yep. Yeah. There's so many variables that we don't understand here. So then we're entering, so then we kind of get to peak week. So typically for peak, again, it changes. I'm just going to give like a rough, you know, what I typically injectable stuff I would probably pull. So I would consider peak week starting generally so if a show is typically on a Saturday, I would consider it starting on the Sunday before, typically, sometimes on the Saturday before. I would remove, this is what, so going back to 2 or 3 weeks out is where I would start to ramp up things like Winstrol.
Yes.
So I'll leverage Winstrol harder than most guys would run. I know you and I are similar with that. I think there's a lot of magic there when you get past the standard on that. And then, you know, going into peak week, I'll usually pull injectables. There is some level of inflammation. There is some level of and things like testosterone, even if you're managing estrogen to some degree, there's still aromatization. You gotta get estrogen as low as possible at this point.
Yes.
A lot of the water issues, if you have any, are going to come from estrogen.
Agreed.
And things like telmisartan are not going to fix the problem.
No.
It's not a Ross issue. This is also times possibly fat burner might be removed, right? Because if you're going to start carb loading, it kind of makes it a little difficult too. Insulin usage gets a little funky here too, depending what you're doing with it, because the food is low, the body fat's low. Depending on what you're doing with refeeding, you don't want to use things like insulin when you're on a low carb diet, because it's kind of a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of variables, like you said, growth hormone. I hate to badmouth. I think there is definitely use for generics, but it's unpredictable, right? I mean, if it has a black top on it in a clear glass bottle in a white box, I mean, who knows what's in it?
I don't like unpredictability at the end. I want predictability.
Yeah. So if you're going to use it at the end, you want to use something that at least you can verify is true. And anyone who's used something like Ceristim before can tell the difference immediately between that and something else. Like it's not even, to me, there's zero confusion there. It's not like, oh, they're similar. They're not similar. That gets manipulated. Testosterone typically, depending on the ester and how the person is looking, the fullness, the water retention, test I might even have pulled before that point. Depending on how hard and how dry they need, I might even pull test at 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Depending.
I do the exact same, 100%.
There are guys that run test all the way in. I can't. I
don't see the need.
I don't have any idea.
I'm not going to take risk though. Yeah, no, honestly, we talked about this off camera, and I'm sure that there would be a lot of fitness influencers that would highly disagree with this. I'm only going to go by the many years that I've been putting people on stage in top shape. And that is, I have more comfortability crashing someone's estrogen the last 10 to 14 days, because we are only trying to achieve the best look possible from an aesthetic standpoint, gnarly conditioning, separated head to toe for one day. We can fix that right after the show's over.
There's no help.
Very fast.
2 weeks.
But I want to pull that as low as possible. So if I got to pull testosterone at the same time 2 weeks out, I'm doing it. And what I've seen only from that happening is the person continuously each and every day gets better. And then the volume of oils comes down. So then that systemic inflammation from pinning goes down as well. So I'll pull injectables depending on the individual. Could be 10 days, could be 14 days total. Sometimes I'll run it 7 days. Again, it's all dependent on the individual, but I'd rather have less oils floating around in the body and just utilize my orals, my AIs, growth hormone. If the person's really responding well to it, they're still dry on it. If not, we're pulling that too. And then, crashing that estrogen at the very end, as long as they're not getting overly flat from that. So we definitely have to see the response with that. But again, Kurt, like you said, that's day-to-day stuff. There could be days that, if the person is really flat, I'll say, okay, today, no thyroid. If they're using thyroid, no clenbuterol, no AI today. We may implement a small dosage of anadrol or something just to bring that.
It could be Anavar, could be halotestin, could be anything.
Exactly. It'll bring that volume back up.
Exactly. If you're lucky enough to be able to run growth in to some degree, generally can keep some level of fullness. Like I stay fuller on growth than I do without, right? There's a couple pounds of fullness that's in there. Test, I mean, depending on the person, I lose 7 to 8 pounds when I pull test fully out. So I can usually be a little heavy going in and pull it, and then I can usually make up that weight with carbs. But it is amazing when you pull it and it drops out. You wake up in the morning and you're like a whole different person.
But Kurt, like a lot of people are not going to grasp what you just said. You lose, what'd you say, 7 to 8 pounds?
Yeah, a lot of. I mean, it's fluid and garbage.
It's fluid. It's not muscle tissue.
No, you're not using tissue.
Yeah. So of course, why on earth would we want to keep that in there if that is that fluid coming out from the subcutaneous layer?
And you'll see all new layer of stuff, like crazy stuff you've never seen.
Exactly.
And all you see the tendons between things, right? Like you see your lat tendons when you hit like your back. You can actually see the tendons between your abs, like when you move. Like
your armpit is so deep that you can't really shave in there. Hardly.
Yeah, like that's what you want. You want this, and that's the thing is like we mentioned this in the last video. The level of leanness you see in guys, like AJ and I are leaner than most humans walk around on a normal basis, but that's not show lean. The stuff you see on Instagram, that's not contest lean is disturbingly lean. Like I remember one summer, decade ago, I guess, I did a bunch of shows in a row. I had done okay for me. I don't have fantastic genetics. I'm not going to ever be a great athlete, but I done okay for me. And my wife was very supportive of my return to this. So she was like, why don't you keep going? So I decided I would do a couple shows in a row. So I held that condition for 2 months. Like you talked about before, you can hold it once you figure out how to
Mhm,
hold that look, you can keep it. I can hold that look.
mhm,
It's painful, but you can keep it.
mhm.
And I remember I went to the beach once with my kids. My kids were little, and like people would like stop what they were doing to like stare at me because they'd
Oh
just
yeah,
never seen that before.
it's a
It's
different
not
level.
like it's not like a fashion model lean. It's like
Mm-mm.
freakish.
Yeah, I mean, I
When people say
remember.
things to you like, "Oh my
Oh
god, you
yeah,
ripped."
yeah, I remember having because I was very naturally vascular. So I remember the middle part of my back. I can post a picture today through my traps and upper back. I had vascularity running through all. So it's just this level of transparency when you're really that lean, where it hurts to sit down on the toilet
Yep.
because you don't have any fat anywhere, man. So yeah. So what we're saying is getting into that final week, real quick synopsis. So we're pulling injectables for the most part. Test is going, could be even 3 weeks with people, have no issues with that whatsoever. Really don't. And
And
whatever.
not to interrupt you, but again, that's why you don't want, in my opinion, you don't want to use long ester test. If you pull
Correct.
test and test cypionate, you don't know when it's coming out. It
No.
might be in a week, it could
Mhm.
be in 3 weeks, it could be in 4
3 weeks. Yep.
weeks, and it'll
Yep.
just drop. And it's like you wake up one day and it's gone. That's the way it
Yes.
works. But like you won't know what day, and then their coach doesn't know what day to deal with that
Mhm.
either. I don't know how to change that look if I don't know what's coming out.
Faster
So
esters are so much more
much easier.
manageable. So again, predictability is going to be key, right? And then orals are going up. The specific orals are going up because we're only getting about 2 weeks of high oral usage, and we know how the liver functionality works, repairs itself. And I've even seen labs the day after the show or 2 days after with hardly any elevation whatsoever. So that the general consensus with people that don't truly grasp it or understand, and they'd be like, well, we'll do trend at 1,000 milligrams for 10 weeks, but you're talking about 150 milligrams of Winstrol. Are you crazy? And it's like, wow. I mean, if you're really weighing that out, I mean, really what works, I'd rather drop trend, 4 weeks out and run that high Winstrol,
Yeah.
which is going to be, again, we've talked about it. That's that DHT derivative. That's what we want. That's the
Yep.
look we want. It does everything that we
Harness.
need it to do. So what I see happen, not only does that water come off, which I believe, obviously, we know that we're managing estrogen better, but we're also getting a reduction of systemic inflammation from constantly
Mhm.
pinning. So we're getting an inflammatory response of coming down. Cortisol to me goes down as well. And then the body just starts looking better and better each and every day. And the person too, I think too, from a psychological standpoint, the fact that they're like, I don't have to pin literally almost every day, man, this is phenomenal. So the mood goes up, and just again, your mind will carry the body. So the better the mind is, the better the body will function.
Yep.
When you're calm, cortisol is down, and you'll see this on show day. People can have this huge cortisol spike on stage. I've seen it happen.
Yeah.
They start sweating profusely. Hypoglycemia happens on stage. They're shaking. They're like, I didn't have enough, honey and rice cakes backstage. It's like,
Mhm.
no, you couldn't control getting into fight or flight. And then you had this huge spike in cortisol,
And that'll screw
glucose
you.
shoots down. Then you just get this crazy watery look because now you've sweated everything out, and just it's a mess on
Yeah,
stage. So
vascularity's gone. Yeah. Totally.
vascularity is gone. Absolutely. So all these issues need to be mitigated through the mind first. And now I will implement certain supplements like Relora, ashwagandha, rhodiola. There's certain things we can do to really magnesium is one of the best. So we utilize these things to bring cortisol down, and Amodin that I talked about as
Mhm.
well last week, which is not the
Not
uh,
Imodium.
yeah,
Imodium.
it's not that. No, it's a Modin. So it's
And
totally
people are
different
taking
mechanism.
anti-diarrhea medicine for
Yeah. So
cortisol.
we want to control cortisol. And then after that, it comes down to how much glycogen replenishment does this person need? How
Yep.
long do they need it for? How much can they hold before they spill out of the intracellular layer into the subcutaneous layer? How much can they hold and maintain? And I think me and you do the same thing, Kurt, is we're going to literally go meal by meal. I mean,
Yep.
at the last couple of days, we're going to take it meal by meal.
And you get the raw data from where? We get it from weeks and weeks and weeks of working with this person. I know how many carbs you can handle. I know when you spill over.
Mhm.
I know when your gut's distended, and I know what food you can handle. You see
Correct.
these coaches do these weird things, introduce a cheeseburger on day of show. Like if you have not had, first of all, you have no idea what the content of that beef is, right? You have no idea how it's cooked, what oil they used. It's going to be a disaster, right? These are all things you haven't had in at least 20 weeks. If you're working with me, at least you're not eating cheeseburgers and fries. I'm not giving someone cheeseburgers and fries in the middle of, in between the morning and the night show. Like that doesn't make
Let me tell you, one of the last times I ever did that was over a decade ago with my wife, who she went undefeated as a women's physique competitor. So after the show, I pretty much knew she had already won. So I was like, well, let's go relax you. We went to Denny's and I gave her a burger and fry. This was over a decade ago again, learning and understanding what we really need, right? Rather than what the normal people were doing, right? The bro science aspect of it, where she would have been better just going back and eating flank steak at that time, jasmine rice with a little bit more salt on it and taking a nap, and would have been phenomenal. The problem is she got food poisoning in between prejudging and finals. We get to the night show, she wins, she does her routine, but at the same time, and she won't get embarrassed because she tells people that she was holding in this explosion of, gastric distress. So she barely made it through awards and ran to the bathroom. So just imagine, I was backstage fanning her down. She couldn't even eat any food after that. You just do not take the risk. You always cook your own food, because guys will ask me, like, after prejudge, they're like, coach, we're looking good, man. We're going to win. Let me know. My family wants to go out. Let me know what I can eat. I'm like, dude, you're going to eat your own food. You're not going out. In fact, you need to go back to your room, take a nap so we can get a drop in cortisol and relax, get off your legs. You can go out with your family after the show. This is not the time.
Not in between.
You've worked way too hard to blow it on food with your family in between prejudging and final. So yeah, none of that nonsense at all.
No, and you don't listen to people, right? I had a personal experience a long time ago competing, where I listened to a friend of mine. He had competed, not particularly successful, but you get in this place where you'll take anyone's advice, right? Like you're hungry and you're tired, and he had me eat a bunch of salt before the prejudging and not drink any fluid. And then in between I did okay in prejudging. Like luckily your placement's generally determined in the prejudging unless you totally blow out the night show.
Yeah.
In between the two, he was like, here, have a Diet Coke. Well, I had like 3 tablespoons of salt. So as soon as we had a Diet Coke to that, I could watch my body fill it like a log. Like literally the water just like went down. And I put on
carbonation mixture with the sodium.
Garbage.
Yeah.
That was it.
Yeah.
I couldn't even check. I remember Steve Weinberger was like, pull your abs in. Yeah, buddy. That's all I got.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, and we will touch on this real quick, and we'll probably go into part 3 on this about mineral shifting and fluid shifting. And, we touched on the potassium and why it's so important. It's kind of the main driver into the cell of the muscle, where we know that sodium, as well as a driver to more water into the subcutaneous layer, causing vasodilation through an acute blood pressure increase. Does it help drive glucose where it needs to go? Yes, it does. But what are we trying to achieve on stage? We're trying to achieve a shift in fluid from sub-Q, intracellular, muscle volumization, and potassium is also one of the main drivers in muscle contractions as well. So that's why if you have too much potassium, your heart stops because you're getting too much of a contraction, right? Hyperkalemia, right? So we need just enough. Again, it's all down to balancing electrolytes, but people really can overshoot sodium thinking that that's the main driver of everything, and then they just look worse and worse and worse, and it actually can cause even more of a sweating effect on stage, because it was too much and the fluids didn't shift where they needed to shift because they left out potassium for the most part, even if they're using a pharmacological diuretic, diazide being triamterene, being the potassium sparing aspect. So you are sparing potassium, but are you taking in a certain amount of potassium? Now, I don't like to carb up people with high potassium foods. We talked about that, but there still needs to be a certain level of potassium in there for proper functionality and balance between, if you want to touch on that, Kurt.
Yeah, I think the problem is over time, we've just gotten away from what the sodium potassium pump is. So potassium's on the inside, sodium's on the outside. Sodium gets kicked out of the cell. That's why if you eat Chinese food or something that's like very salty, the next day your skin is puffy. So you can definitely overdo it. Yes, carbohydrates are moved on the sodium potassium pump and then they enter through GLUT4, but that doesn't mean that sodium is not actually taking it in. That requires potassium. So like we can, like you said, we should probably do a third part just on the mineral stuff. I think there's a lot to go there, but I judge someone's final look a couple days out based on like what I'm going to do with minerals, if I'm going to touch minerals based on what their look is, right? Are they flat? Are they vascular? Are they, are they soft? There's a lot of things that go on, and then it's a different technique, right? Is it aldactone? Is it diuretic? Is it adding more sodium? Is it adding more potassium? It's not just one thing. And I think in fitness now, it just seems everyone wants to just use sodium, and then everyone's using potassium. It's like then they're using ARBs that are causing high potassium. It's like they're skewing everything artificially. It'd be easier if you didn't use all those things.
They'll use ARBs, but if you bring up aldactone, they're like, "Whoa, that's no way! I would never touch aldactone." Which again, I would never use it on every case because it's a case by case scenario. But you're going to use telmisartan, and what's one of the biggest side effects of telmisartan? It's going to increase potassium serum like through the roof, especially when you're getting to 60 to 80 milligrams a day, which a lot of guys tend to do.
Not even thinking about, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I correlate it with aldosterone levels. I've had clients that have never been in shape before. These are big name IFBB pros, huge guys. And I, just from anecdote and just kind of studying their years past, I'm like, well, what's the aldosterone looking like? We get labs checked. Their aldosterone levels are off the charts. So then we need to understand the mechanisms coming into the final week of using an anti-mineral corticoid, which is aldactone, right? Because we need to control that through being able to mitigate too high of aldosterone. So then you have to get into the mechanism of what's the onset peak time, what's the half-life, when to stop it so we can reabsorb sodium, how high do we take potassium? And we do just remember, like I said, guys, it's just enough to get the most out of the least amount. We're not talking about overshooting stuff for 5-10 days. We're talking about 2 days, maybe getting just enough of that shift in fluid. And then, like Kurt said, you got to look at the client and see visually what's going on. How's the contraction as well? And then we know what mineral we need to increase, what mineral we need to hold. And typically more times than not, it's not always a glycogen thing. It's either H2O fluid or minerals that need to be shifted into the muscle the last day. So it takes an eye to know and understand how to do that. And that's a deep dive into the mechanisms of the body.
Why don't we do a third part with all that? And then we could even do coming out, what the week after a show should look like, how you rebound.
So important.
Right? Whether you're doing another show or you're transitioning into something else. I think that's a really good one too, because you see a lot of really weird stuff go on there, right?
Man, some of the biggest mistakes I've seen are post-show where guys literally undo 4 or 5 months of hard work in a week. A week to 2 weeks, yeah. And then what have we done? We've put so much strain on the heart. It's insane. I've never trained someone like this, but I've heard stories where guys go so over the top they have to be rushed to the hospital to get IV Lasix because they're 45 pounds up and the edema is so bad that their resting heart rate is now 155, 160 beats per minute because food was just it's an unhealthy relationship.
There's something really.
Let's put it that way. I mean, that's what it comes down to. I love food, but man, my health is so much more important. So you kind of have to understand when it's post-show, it's time to kind of get back into a health phase now. We really did a lot of extreme things to get you there, but now we need to get the body healthy and functional for the improvements that are coming up for the rest of the season. Or if we're going into another show. Another show is going to be a whole nother topic too, because now we have to mitigate all those levels of mineral shifting and rebound effects.
And when gear's been pulled out, right? It might, depending on the duration, you might need to add things back in or leave them out, depending, right? I mean, it depends on the situation.
It's tricky. No, it's definitely tricky. I'm not going to say it's not tricky, but again, that's where we take all that data and we implement it into the athlete. And so we can go from reverse dieting into a progression season, also known as an off season. Or we can also talk about next two, or we'll talk about both. How do we shift into show number 2, whether it be a week out, because sometimes that'll be the scenario, or is it 2 or 3 weeks away, or is it even 6 weeks away, which can also be tough for people to manage as well. So that's a whole nother beast right there, which I think would be a great way to leave this off for people. I think we gave you guys a lot of good information to implement into your program. Me and Kurt see eye to eye on pretty much everything. It's pretty cool to see that, because he's so highly respected by myself because of the medical background that he comes from. And I do want to just touch on this, guys, and this is not a shot at anybody. I don't really pay attention too much of what anybody's doing, but I just know that there's a lot of information filtering out there of everybody trying to kind of reinvent the wheel. And I said this in the beginning, Guys, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. What has worked has always worked. Don't overanalyze it. You have a good coach that is going to control all those markers and variables. Trust that process. Tell him everything, every biofeedback marker, every stick of gum extra that maybe you ate, because it's important to know what's going in the system, or stress at home. Maybe you got into an argument with your wife, you didn't sleep for 2 or 3 days, or maybe you went out and you were drinking a lot of sugar-free, artificial drinks. So therefore it made you, crave salt more. So you put more salt on it, then you drank more. And those usually go hand in hand too. So those will all be variables that we need to know and data we need to know. So trust the process. Don't overanalyze what you're seeing on social media. Get it from trusted sources that are continuously putting good physiques on stage time after time after time. And then, of course, me and Kurt have been there. We've walked the walk at some point or another. So we obviously know where we've been, and we know where you want to get. And we know psychologically what it takes to get there. It is extremely, extremely hard. And I totally understand it from that standpoint. And that is what half the fun is, right? Because I think me and you are the same too. When I'm hungry, and I wasn't like this when I was younger, I shifted though. When I'm hungry, I tell myself, I'm in a fat burning stage. I'm losing body fat. I'm enjoying this because I know progress is happening. At some point or another, progress is happening. So I'm going to suck it up, and I'm actually enjoying the fact that I'm hungry. So if you flip that psychology and actually be grateful, and I talk about this every day, I get to eat 5 to 6 meals a day and drink 2 gallons of water. What the heck am I complaining about? Because there's people that don't even know if they get one piece of bread today. So change your perspective and be grateful. And that really shifts your attitude of gratitude every day, because it does get tough. You go into a dark place in prep, no doubt about it. But if you can shift that perspective, it will change everything. So just remember, psychologically, everything flows out. Like Kurt said, from this, it's 90% of it. It's 90%.
And that's something that I lean on you a lot for lately too. As just your thought process to me is flawless.
I appreciate it,
in the way you think. So something else I was just going to leave the audience with, because I get a lot of perspective, like mentorship things. Guys want to be a coach. They want to know like what the way to do this. I think there's a fine balance between knowledge, right? I think there is something to be said about education per se. Do I think it's needed? No. I think there's knowledge that's gained through experience. And I think experience and being able to do this to yourself is the biggest thing.
Yeah.
I see a lot of guys that might have, perhaps what it takes on paper, but if you can't get yourself in shape and you can't do this stuff, you're probably not going to be a very successful coach.
I agree.
Right? Like I have to know what it's like to suffer in order to have someone else do that same thing.
I agree. I think firsthand knowledge of experience is very important. 100%, Kurt.
Well, I thank everyone for watching again, and we will we'll obviously keep continuing with this. If anyone thinks of anything else that they want to hear, please just comment below or whatever, or I'll post AJ's link tree again, and
maybe we'll do a Q&A too. We'll follow up with Q&A.
Sure.
So if you guys want to drop some questions down, we will do a separate.
I could put something on Instagram. It's probably even easier. I'll do
we'll do a separate video of question and answer, because I'm sure you guys are going to watch this hour-long video. And man, thank you, Kurt, for filming this with me. Kurt has been doing podcasts all morning. And this guy needs some rest, man. But guess what? He's working hard for you guys, putting out phenomenal content. So thank you, Kurt, for battling through that 1 hour, because I know that I can talk a lot and get onto a lot of tangents.
No, it's always good to know. Cool. Thank you, AJ. Thank you, everyone, for listening.